Well, fear and bullying obviously works a lot better if the other party is dependent on you. And since we last spoke again, this new term has been introduced called dual circulation. And I was wondering whether you could explain to us what it is and why Western, but especially European firms, should care about its consequences.
They definitely should. And I think that it's an extension of a previous discussion which worried people in the West about China wanting to seek self-reliance in a range of really high-end technologies and sectors. And that desire for self-reliance, or what China sometimes used to call indigenous innovation, was often heard in places like Washington, D.C. as basically China planning to steal as much Western technology as it could, invite Western companies into China with the promise of markets sort of access, transfer as much of their technology as they could, and then through things like the Made in China 2025 program that got so much attention a couple of years ago, the idea was that China would kind of get strong in these fields and basically throw the foreigners out. The dual circulation theory that you correctly say is now, described in some detail, including by the top leader Xi Jinping, is a sort of an extension and an explanation of how self-reliance can combine with an economic model within China, which is much more about relying on China's domestic consumer economy to drive future growth. So the old discussion, which already got people in the West worried, was that China's view of openness to globalization was changing, that China was less and less really interested in thinking in the very long term about long-term equal relationships and partnerships with the West, that the idea was just take our technology and then throw us out. That was the old concern. It's now been joined by a more kind of domestic concern that China is increasingly convinced that the most sustainable and in some ways the safest source of future growth is going to be based on Chinese domestic consumption, with foreign growth and foreign trade as a kind of nice add-on that brings with it useful investment and useful markets, but that fundamentally China needs to look to its own extraordinary market power to drive its own growth. And there was a very useful speech that Xi Jinping gave to senior level officials at ministerial level and provincial leaders in January, on January the 11th, describing this new development paradigm, drawing on the dual circulation theory. It was then published in full in the leading theoretical journal of the Communist Party, Chiushi, and this happened last month. An incredibly useful document, not very long, but full of really concrete examples. In particular, Xi Jinping told a story about how last year, the height of the COVID pandemic, he made a study tour of one of the big coastal provinces, Zhejiang, that is, extremely open to globalization, was one of the pioneering provinces of reform and opening up. And he saw that some of their most important supply chains had been interrupted by COVID supply difficulties, and that this had caused real disruption in the economy of Zhejiang. And that this, he said, had made him rethink the entire kind of reform and opening view of China growing rich and strong on the back of global supply chains that sourced important materials overseas and sought important markets overseas, and then were as open to sort of imports and exports as possible. That kind of export-led growth model of the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. And he cited this famous Chinese phrase about having both heads outside, liang tuo wai, and then da jin da chu, in great sort of number of imports, great number of exports, and that paradigm no longer feels appropriate in a world where globalization is being unrolled by populist politicians overseas, and he didn't mention Donald Trump, but that was clearly at the back of his mind, where China found itself vulnerable, not just economically, but even in terms of national security, to what he called technology choke points, forms of high technology, semiconductors, the kit that makes semiconductors, for instance, that America still has a lead in, and America is willing to use to choke off supplies that Chinese champions need to, continue and fuel their rise to global dominance. And that idea that China is getting richer and stronger, but is still vulnerable to certain key technologies that America can choke off, is now clearly unacceptable to Xi Jinping. And as a result, he is willing to posit a kind of a double vision, a double message from China, that China is still open to the world where it suits China, but is not interested in being dependent on the world for anything that is crucial to China's economic or national security.